Morning, everybody, and welcome to Corruption and Coronavirus, a panel discussion about the role of transparency in ensuring an effective response and recovery, organised by Open Ownership. My name's Simon Long. I'm a journalist at The Economist, where I've been for a quarter of a century now. Before that, I was 10 years at the BBC, and way back I had a shady past as an investment banker. That was before Big Bang, in fact. So I'm as old as I look. And in all that time, I've moderated a lot of panel discussions, but never before over Zoom, so please bear with me. The panel's being recorded several times over for safety, so hope it will survive for posterity. And the hope is it will explore the issues at the heart of tackling corruption in healthcare and disaster response, as well as the need to ensure an equitable, fair, and corruption-free global economic response. Firstly, let me introduce very briefly the panelists. We have John Penrose MP, the UK government's anti-corruption champion, Rachel Cooper from Transparency International, where she's director of the Health Initiative, Professor Sope-Williams-Elegbe from Stellenbosch University, where she's head of the Department of Mercantile Law and the deputy director of the African Procurement Law Unit, Sidanius from Refinitiv, the global head of financial crime and industry affairs there, what I still tend to think of as Thomson Reuters, the big financial data provider, and of course Thom Townsend from our host's Open Ownership, where he's the executive director. So thanks to all of them for making time for this, and perhaps will allow me just a couple of minutes to set the scene. I suppose most of you are at least familiar with Open Ownership, which is why you're here. If not, as far as I can gather, the clue is in the name. It's a global hub for bringing information about the true beneficial ownership of companies into the sunlight, offering support in that endeavour, ranging from drafting laws to verifying data to making it work in practice and organising online Zoom conferences. So it's fair to assume that some of our discussion will focus on issues of ownership transparency and the part that plays in curbing corruption. But I hope it will go even broader than that, given the extraordinary times we're in. Most observers think we're on the brink of the biggest economic slump since the Great Depression. The IMF's most recent forecast was for a 3% contraction in the global economy this year, in contrast to 3% growth last year. And many observers think the IMF is in fact being too sanguine. The consequences of the pandemic can still only be guessed at. It's not unreasonable to worry about worsening social and ethnic divisions in a number of countries, or about widening inequality and even worsening hunger in many places. At the very least, it's likely to bring political instability. Against this background, rich world governments seem to have little option but to print money to throw at the problem. Already a staggering $5.5 trillion and counting has been committed by G20 governments. And where sums of that magnitude are involved, of course, it's right to be concerned about how much will be squandered or lost through corruption. In particular, that's a valid concern if you consider the mood of near panic in a number of countries about securing the supplies needed to combat the virus. The approach seems to be get hold of the necessary and ask questions later. And on an even larger scale, that's also the answer to stemming economic collapse. Here's a quote to which Open Ownership drew my attention from, believe it or not, the head of the UK Office for Budget Responsibility, Robert Choate. When the fire is large enough, you just spray water and worry about it later. That's the Office for Budget Responsibility. Well, Robert Choate is a former journalist, but he highlights, I think, why the scrutiny of the companies that get hold of some of this taxpayer largesse matters so much. A word about the format. Each of our panelists is going to speak for about 7 minutes, and I will send them messages or try and attract their attention somehow if they overrun too much. And we'll then attempt a more general discussion, but be sure to leave time for a question and answer session. That is going to be run through the chat function that you'll see at the bottom of your screens. You can ask questions at any time, and if we manage to work the technology correct, they'll be stored and I'll be able to come back to them. But first, to John Penrose. John Penrose was appointed the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion in December 2017 and reappointed in July last year. He was previously a Minister of State in the Northern Ireland office from November 2018 to July 2019, and was first elected as an MP for Western Wall and the Villages, a wonderful name for a constituency, in 2005. As the PM's anti-corruption champion, he's responsible for challenging and coordinating the UK response to corruption and the implementation of the first UK anti-corruption strategy, and leading the UK's push to strengthen the international response and representing the UK at relevant international forums. So a key question for him from this panel, I guess, is why does this reform matter now, that of beneficial ownership, and what opportunities are there to deliver it in what in many countries is a resource-constrained environment? John, over to you.
I was starting by saying, firstly, thank you to OpenOwnership for organising this, and to Simon for hosting us and moderating this. There's a global response going on here, and Simon, in his introductory remarks, gave some sense of the amount of money which is now sloshing around the different healthcare systems and the different procurement systems in the world, and also gave a very good example from, I think it was Robert Choate, one of the most sober-sided people you can possibly come across, saying like there's an awful lot of people just spraying money around like water. And that creates, that is inevitably an entirely understandable response to by leaders and governments everywhere to a global pandemic which is taking lives and claiming tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. But it is also extremely worrying for those of us who care about corruption, and that should be everybody, because it just creates, if you are an organised criminal, it creates a dripping roast. It creates an enormous opportunity for people who wish to behave badly to just make hay. And what I think what worries me most is that what we have is a situation where if you don't have the rules in place, if you don't have the processes, the procedures, the safeguards, the audit checks in place already, most people are trying to move at pace. They are trying to cut corners wherever they can because they are so determined and concerned about moving at pace. So whatever you had in place before the pandemic started is going to be under a great deal of pressure now the pandemic is underway. And around the world, different countries are starting from different places. Some are highly controlled and have got good anti-corruption controls in place, others much less so. But whatever you began from, whatever your starting point baseline was, it's going to be weaker because everyone is trying to move at pace and for understandable reasons. And so therefore, the opportunity, if you are an organised criminal, is probably greater than it's been for years and years and years. And I think that therefore one of the things that we are going to have to do as an international community is to say to the people involved in this, look, yes, you're trying to move at pace. Yes, you are trying to save lives and to do the necessary without having to worry about pettifogging bureaucracy and all those things. But just bear in mind that when this is all over, and probably before that in many countries, there's going to be an inquiry. There's going to be multiple inquiries. There's going to be civil society, the people on this call, but also official inquiries in many countries as well, following up on the decisions that you take now. And if you do just spray money around like water and you don't look after what's happening with it, then reputations and in some cases careers and in some cases liberties are going to be lost because there's going to be an audit trail. And if there isn't an audit trail, then people are going to ask even more questions of you if you're not providing it in the first place. And so therefore, I think we just need to get people past the initial panicked, we've got to do this quickly reaction. That is understandable, and I think it's actually probably right that we need to do this quickly. And we just say, yes, we do, but in everyone's understandable urge to move fast and cut corners, there are some corners that you cannot cut. As the chief executive, I think it was, of the IMF said, spend the money you need to spend, but keep the receipts, is the sort of the governing thought. And if we can do that, then I think we can instill rather more of the kinds of disciplines which will still be required, even though everybody's systems are under pressure. One thought as well, even for countries which don't have systems which are terribly robust at the moment, and even for those of us whose systems are under enormous pressure because of people trying to move fast, one of the things which I just keep on coming back to is going to be, if not a magic bullet, is going to be one of the ways of maintaining the essential audit checks and maintaining as much integrity as we possibly can, is going to be this point about beneficial ownership. So even if you cannot do, even if you haven't got time to do many of the other checks which you would ordinarily want to do or have, or which your systems would require, even if those systems are being short-circuited and short-cut, just being able to check the beneficial ownership of the people you are buying from and the people you're paying money to, as Rachel was giving good examples of in her remarks earlier on, that can just solve an awful lot of problems and make sure that you as a public official are in a much safer place when the subsequent checks and inquiries ultimately come. Because if you can check that, and then you can say, well, hang on a second, I want to just make sure that I understand who the owner of this particular company purporting to be able to supply me with masks is, that will give you an enormous amount of information. It won't be perfect, but it is incredibly powerful, and it's probably the single most powerful thing that many organizations and many public officials can do. And so I think that therefore it would be naive for any of us to say that the urge to speed, the urge to save lives, the urge to do this now and to not get bogged down in bureaucracy isn't not only there and isn't powerful and isn't actually in many cases right. We just need to make sure that people don't see this as an either-or equation, that people see this as something where you can say, yes, you can move fast, you must move fast, you must try and find supplies of PPE or whatever else it may be, or reagent for your testing kit. But that shouldn't be instead of due diligence. You can still do much due diligence, and you can do it effectively, particularly if you have kinds of open ownership, beneficial ownership transparency, which I and others think are so important.
Thank you very much, John. That was very helpful, and thank you for being so spot on. You have an internal clock. You're spot on 7 minutes. But next week, Rachel joined Transparency International in November 2017 to lead the Health Initiative's flagship project on open contracting in the health sector and to develop other areas of the programme, especially around research and development, procurement and service delivery. She joined TI UK after a career in the Foreign Office and delivering global health projects with international NGOs and medical royal colleges. I think she's going to give us an overview of how corruption risk is impacting COVID delivery and what this crisis means for corruption in healthcare more broadly. This has been one of the most corruption-prone sectors for many years, which is something I didn't actually know. So thank you very much, Rachel, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, gosh, what a big subject. I mean, as you've already anticipated, the risk of corruption in global healthcare is massive. And when we're talking about that risk, we look across the whole value chain, from research and development through manufacturing, procurement, all the way through to the point of interaction between health professionals and patients at service delivery. And the biggest risk within that value chain is around procurement. And now at the height of the pandemic, that is very much in the spotlight. And all the risks that are manifest, and procurement is thought to be where up to kind of 25% of procurement funding ends up being corrupted. So there's heightened awareness of that and the role and importance of procurement in disease prevention and ultimately in improving health outcomes. And I suppose that coming from a health background, from the Health Initiative, I should start from that kind of basis, that this is actually all about how it impacts efficacy, efficiency of procurement and budget allocation, and ultimately of the relationship to the equity, universal health coverage, and leaving no one behind agendas. So the foundation is that beneficial ownership opacity hinders delivery of healthcare provision, particularly at a time like this when all risks are exacerbated. So what are we actually talking about? Well, the first kind of interaction and first manifestation of those risks is at the point of research and development. We see massive public and government and scientific effort to deliver diagnostics, to deliver therapies and treatments, and above all, to deliver a potential vaccine. But who's going to profit? Who stands to profit from the development of those? And, you know, we're probably talking about the biggest blockbusters of health technology in history. The stakes are massive, but equally the temptations will be there. And we already know in research and development that there can be a temptation, particularly in the private sector R&D space, to manipulate data, to design studies to make technologies or trial results as profitable as possible. And equally, you know, there tends to be a focus on positive results. No one really wants to kind of fess up that their trials, their designs have been less than positive. Negative results are not welcome, but we need to acknowledge all of that, and we need to know, in the context of beneficial ownership, who stands to profit. So, and if we don't know that, and we don't know who's going to profit, and we don't know about beneficial ownership, then there is a risk that health policy decision makers may end up recommending, supporting drugs, treatments, vaccines, which they may end up profiting from. People won't be aware of conflicts of interest, of revolving doors. And equally, we need to know about who's funding trials, who's funding studies. Naturally, when industry is sponsoring, the stakes are higher and there's a greater risk of undue influence. And as I said, there can be a focus on more favourable results. So that's the first context, at the beginning of that value chain. And I just want to kind of focus now a little on the middle of that chain. And that is the kind of point of procurement. So governments are procuring massive amounts of essential and life-saving goods. And as the need for those products becomes more urgent, we've seen a loosening in regulation. Governments are resorting to emergency procurement measures, negotiated arrangements. You look around the world, from Zimbabwe, reduced its procurement from 2 weeks to 48 hours, to the UK, to India, a lot of changes, of relaxations. But all of those changes bring the risk of new risks. People don't exactly understand them. They don't know how they're going to manifest. Authorities are also balancing and facing multiple challenges. That political public pressure and expectation to deliver and to get us all out of this twilight, existence. And they're doing that against the background of administrative and operational capacity issues. We're all working differently. They're doing it against a background of how do you regulate the technical, the traditional kind of regulatory functions of registration and assessment. And then you also have on top of that a private sector that is often in a fight for survival, sheer business survival. So all of these things exacerbate the risks and the opportunities of corruption in procurement. So from an anti-corruption perspective, and it obviously differs according to the context, we can assume that regulation change results in a high use of single bidding, of non-open procedures, short advertisement periods, and then that traditionally used red flags and monitoring methodologies are probably of less or of limited use. So some of the specific kind of risks in procurement that are of most relevance to beneficial ownership. The suppliers of COVID devices showing up that they have little or no obvious relation to their supplied product or service, no background in delivering that service or that product. Shell companies supplying emergency services, conflicts of interest, are there nepotistic connections? And we've seen a few manifestations of all of those. What can we do about that? Just before I come on to a few of those manifestations, we need to improve the resilience of the response. And you can do that by combining and cross-checking the often separated knowledge and data set provisions around beneficial ownership and procurement. So bringing those together and cross-analysing them. For instance, procurement data that highlights whether in highly technical areas, companies are winning tenders that they've got no history of winning before. And you can analyse that, cross-check it against beneficial ownership, discover whether the company has been recently established, and gain a fuller picture about where the money that is needed to fight this virus is truly going. So how are we actually seeing this manifested? Suppliers of COVID devices are showing up that they've got little or no obvious relation to their supplied product or service. Here in the UK, we had lots of media coverage and publicity that that Dyson were going to provide ventilators, and now we're being told that they're no longer needed. The Trump administration awarded a $55 million contract to a bankrupt company with 0 employees for masks, which it's never manufactured. We have examples from Romania of a shell company supplying emergency supplies. Again, masks, millions of masks, questionable quality, from a convicted organised crime associate. Now, if you start to cross-check some of that ownership and procurement data, you'll begin to pick that up. And then conflicts of interest. I've mentioned that a little, but the Brazilian government awarded a mask contract with prices up to 12 times higher than mask contracts awarded earlier in the year. And who to? To a company with ties to the president. So I think all of those examples really just highlight that in times of this real tension, we obviously need to respond to speed, but we also need to ensure that we're doing so with rigour and that we're not losing where we need to check, that we're continuing to check the right things. And that's not crossing every I, crossing every T, dotting every I. It's about really highlighting and identifying the most pressing key vulnerabilities and corruption vulnerabilities, and tracking those back to ensure that we've got retrospective accountability. And ultimately, why is that so important? You have to bring that back to, to this global health response. We are all only as strong as the kind of weakest link in this healthcare chain, in this global health system response. And so we all have a responsibility in our own individual ways to spot those loopholes. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It was great. But next week we move. It's not quite a breakfast of champions, but 11s of champions this morning. We have another anti-corruption champion, Professor Sope-Williams-Elegbe from Stellenbosch University. She specializes in public procurement law, anti-corruption law, sustainable development, and commercial law. She's written over 50 publications in the areas of anti-corruption and public procurement law, including a number of books, and is an editor of the Journal of African Law. Her champion role is something she was appointed to by the UNODC, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, last year. Now, I hope, Sope, you can outline for us how the risks that John and Rachel have been talking about are actually manifesting themselves in South Africa and the broader sub-Saharan region. And so help us to discuss how, beyond emergency response and healthcare delivery, public management challenges that many governments face could be exacerbated by COVID and the economic shock. Professor Williams-Elegbe, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. So good to be here. All right, so I'll say for us here, we are probably having a different kind of experience in some ways than I'll say some countries in the global north. So for us, there are kind of 5 sectors which are at risk. So we have, obviously, like everyone else, economic support for business, but we're also having cash transfers to individuals. And this is individuals in the formal and the informal sectors as well. So there are a lot of difficulties there just with data and information. In terms of procurement, of course, our health sectors are under strain, but also our educational sectors, because we're having to move to distance learning or online teaching, whatever you want to call it, without really having the capacity for that. And it's not only on the institutional side, so it's not only on the educational institutional side, but also for a lot of universities, for instance, they've had to provide devices to thousands of students. So getting those devices in less than a week has proved challenging, and there are concerns there. And of course, IT infrastructure and services. We also have an issue of distributing food parcels to vulnerable populations. And of course, if you know anything about South Africa, and Nigeria, high poverty rates, a lot of people in the informal economy where they only get paid daily by stuff that they sell a day. And so with the lockdown, it means they're not getting those daily wages, they're not getting money to feed, so they have to be taken care of. And then the other area where we're going to struggle with is with foreign aid, whether that's coming in the form of loans or grants. Historically, a lot of African countries haven't done very well in managing that, and there's a huge influx coming in right now. And so the risks that are going to arise because of existing systemic vulnerabilities and loopholes, which will be exploited, as Rachel and John have said, as well as the fact that there is a reduction in oversight and in controls and in transparency. So we're already seeing evidence of risk of theft and embezzlement, mismanagement of funds, which are supposed to be directed at businesses or individuals, as I've mentioned. There's already stories about diversion of resources, not just cash, but things like food parcels, as I mentioned, devices, because we're circumventing all the normal processes for managing government assets and managing government resources. I think Rachel has already highlighted because of this emergency procurement, there's a lack of competition. So that has come with price gouging, that's come with contracts going to dodgy people, even contracts going to organized criminal syndicates, collusion between the public and private sectors. We are having a lot of hidden contracts. I think Rachel also mentioned, substandard delivery by companies who have no business winning, contracts for health goods, short delivery. And so all this is happening, and it's happening in real time, and it's happening at a time when we really can't afford for those things to actually be happening. And for us on this side, some of the issues that are going to be exacerbated by this, this situation we find ourselves, especially in South Africa, we're going to see widening social inequalities. I've talked about people who are in the informal sector who, they only get paid daily, and those who are in jobs who will still be able to maintain some semblance of a life. We're already seeing increased social unrest. Of course, there's increased opportunities for diverting attention away from governance failures. We are going to be seeing crowding out of small and medium enterprises, of course, from the procurement sector. So while before we've had a system that ensures that smaller businesses have access to government contracts, that's all being thrown out of the window. And of course, it means that those businesses are going to be less likely to survive. And the other thing that is going to happen is that we're strengthening the black markets, if I can put it that way, and we're strengthening organized crime. I think we can talk about that a little bit later. And I think, as John mentioned, if we don't really take action and ensure that we mainstream transparency and disclosure and oversight, even though we're in the midst of a pandemic and things have to be done quickly, we're going to have a lot of problems, not just now, but when all this is over. And one of the big problems is that we're going to be, as opposed to rebuilding our economies, after the pandemic, we're going to be trying to clean up. And that will be a big distraction from rebuilding our economies and our societies. We will probably see prosecutions, which might constrain the ability of key departments to be forward focused or to move forward. And in other areas, we might see paralysis, which will be caused by fear of investigations or making a mistake. We're going to have all these investigations, which are going to second guess purchases that happened 3, 4, 5 months ago. And generally, if we don't take action against corruption as we're going on, we're going to constrain the effectiveness of our responses to the pandemic. And the bottom line is that it will lead to a loss of life. What we saw from the Ebola crisis, where there was widespread corruption in some of the countries that were severely affected by the pandemic, was that people didn't get what they needed. The health sector could not deliver in many sectors and in many segments of societies. So yes, to ensure that we can address this pandemic as best as we can, we have to ensure that we don't totally eliminate the controls in this desire to spend. We should try as much as possible governments should try as much as possible to ensure full transparency and disclosure of all COVID-related procurements during the pandemic, price information, beneficial ownership, justifications for procurements as much as possible. We need to make sure that the administration of these responses, especially both foreign and local funds, really is done appropriately. And there must be reporting at certain stages. The audit trail must not be lost, and we should make sure that our whistleblowing portals are alive. And I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Sope. Another miracle of precise timing, and very interesting talk. Next, we have Sidanius from Refinitiv, the Global Head of Financial Crime and Industry Affairs there. That role is to manage how regulatory changes around financial crime affect risk and supply chain businesses globally. His responsibilities include proposing courses of action to address regulatory changes and drive execution through his organization. And his previous experience includes working at Big Four consultancies in capital markets advisory. He was a senior advisor at the Bank of England and a senior examiner at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 2007 to 2009, which was quite an interesting time to be in that job. So he's going to give us a view on how the financial sector is adapting to COVID and how his business, as one of the main suppliers of business intelligence globally, is seeing markets respond. Che, over to you.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you for Open Ownership for organizing this incredibly important topic around transparency in the age of COVID-19. So as Simon alluded to, in terms of my professional background, it seems that my roles in my professional career go from one crisis to another. So I was at the New York Fed during the financial crisis and came over to England to help the Bank of England restructure its operating model from a macro-prudential perspective. And then when I joined Thomson Reuters, then now Refinitiv for the last 2 years, we are finding ourselves, again in a crisis in terms of how we as a company can respond, and really trying to emphasize the point on how we can encourage greater collaboration among the public and the private sector. And I can't think of a more opportune time to do that in the COVID-19 situation. So as a bit of a context of my role and what we're trying to do and kind of our contribution to this discussion. So for those who may not be familiar with us, we are one of the largest data providers to both the public and the private sector for their screening purposes, for their supply chain risk management purposes, and also their regulatory requirements as far as meeting their AML obligations and sanctions regulation. And there was a recognition a few years ago, certainly when I joined, that we could do more in terms of not just supplying data, but really because we were a bit like the connecting tissue throughout in the financial services industry, but also the corporate industry, there are certain aspects that we thought that we could really improve. Really around how to make the system more effective, and I'm talking about here fighting financial crime, which of course includes corruption and fraud, how we can encourage more collaboration, information sharing across the public and private sector. In that context, I can almost break it down to sort of pre-COVID versus the current COVID crisis. I think there was a great momentum being built through a number of different policy platforms and agendas. So there's a great focus at the B20 level that we're part of on increased transparency for ultimate beneficial ownership and public registries. This is nothing new, but the real issue is what practical solutions should we advise the policymakers to adopt, and we can get into some of those later on. And then, of course, this whole issue of how we can, do better in terms of working together across the public and private sector. And I think the COVID-19 has really put this at a real focus because this is a situation which is greater than any of us, both across the public and private sector, and it's really around how we can support each other in the best possible way. And in the example that's mentioned before, in the healthcare sector, which is particularly vulnerable here, and we know this, we heard from reports last week as part of a consortium that we were part of called the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. We were heard from Interpol and Europol on some very troubling trends, and it's been alluded to that every crisis is an opportunity, and criminals are as imaginative and entrepreneurial as the private sector, and so they're taking advantage of this. And the healthcare sector, of course, is one of those sectors that are particularly vulnerable. Because very few of them actually do or have some kind of due diligence procedure in the current state. And second, of course, it's been mentioned that there's an absolute acute need of speed and getting supplies wherever they can get them. And if that means paying a higher price and not doing the proper screening or due diligence in terms of where are these sources coming from, how useful are they actually going to serve the purposes that's been advertised on the tin, and we've seen reports in the BBC and others that there's some real risk there. In terms of where we go from here, so from a UBO specific perspective, there are two challenges in the industry that we're trying to find a way. The first is the availability of information for public registries. And what I mean by that is we reviewed, so we're a supplier and we consume data and we've supplied data, particularly around corporate registries. And we did a review of the 247 jurisdictions in the world that have some form of public registries. But when we actually looked at the data itself, what's available, we found that only half of them had any information on directorships. a little more than half had any information on shareholders. So that's the first step, is making sure that it's available and that it's complete. And also there's some kind of international standards in terms of the types of information that's being done and being shared and being available to the industry, so they can actually start doing cross-border analysis and making sure that there's an understanding of the connectivity. And of course, public registries, as we all know, are very complex. Corporate structures can be incredibly complex, and they're complex for a reason, not just for tax reasons, but also to hide the potentially the activity or the owners. The second issue is the quality of information. Unfortunately, no one has really taken the baton of actually ensuring that the information is accurate, that there's some kind of process that actually reviews on some timely basis when information gets changed or modified. And this is another area that needs to be discussed, and there needs to be some kind of international framework and minimum standards around that. And I think that those two things, despite the fact that they may sound very quite simple, are quite complex when it gets into international sort of rules and standards. And this is an area that we're pushing the B20 quite hard in terms of concretely coming to some kind of agreement on how we can look at this issue. Not only is it important in terms of dealing with some of the inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in the private sector, but it also has unintended social consequences. So in the banking industry, for instance, it's leading to financial exclusion. It's leading to risk assessments that some regions are just too risky for them to provide financial services and funding to. It also becomes complex for small and medium-sized businesses to expand cross-border if they're not able to sort of use the information that they had within their jurisdiction, and that information can then be leveraged in other jurisdictions as a way of making it, the cost of doing business will make it easier for them. And then the last thing I guess I will leave you with, and then hopefully I would have had my internal clock synced in as with the others. For us at the end of the day, in terms of what COVID-19 is going to expose, and it was mentioned before, which is completely right, that speed is now the essence. Compliance is now taking a backseat. And how to distribute and execute against an unprecedented fiscal stimulus is now at the highest sort of order. But there will be a post-review, and I base this from my experience in the financial crisis when there was another unprecedented tax bailout, and people and companies will be held to account on that. Number one. Number two. We may not have time to touch on this, but there will be a complete shift in terms of how companies think of supply chain risk. You may have seen in a number of different areas where Western companies have, in effect, contractually exercised force majeure. So they have completely cut off the manufacturing and the production capabilities of many areas in Asia, for instance, like Bangladesh and India, which is going to feed into the social strife in those regions. And there will be potentially a shift in terms of onshoring some of that production capacity. So that only feeds into increased social inequality and some of the increased political dynamics going forward. So I'll leave it there, but those are kind of the key highlights. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Che. That's great. And finally, we come to our host, OpenOwnership, and its Executive Director, Thom Townsend. He's both Executive Director and the group's Chief Strategist, directing implementation efforts and working with partners to maximize impact. He's an expert on open data and was previously the head of data policy for the UK government. He's led some of the UK's biggest open data commitments at national and global level, and has spent his career ensuring that good data is being produced and used inside and outside government. He led the open contracting elements of the 2016 London Anti-Corruption Summit, which is, as I understand it, is where the real push towards open, usable, beneficial ownership data got started, and why OpenOwnership was launched. So Thom can tell us more about that, and he's going to round off the panel talking about that, beneficial ownership data, and how that can support mitigating the risks we've been talking about. And then we'll move on to Q&A. Thom.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for agreeing to moderate this. We're really grateful, and a huge thanks to all of the panelists for joining us this morning. This is an incredibly important conversation, and one that I think we need to see more of as we plot our next steps as a community who care about this, who know the benefits of beneficial ownership disclosure and really robust measures for tackling corruption. We have a real job of work on our hands to be proactive, constructive, and really think through the ways that we can be supporting governments around the world to do the important work that we know still needs to take place, but is having to take place in a resource-constrained and emergency environment. These are really, really tough conditions for all of us, and it's our sort of time to rise to that challenge. I think I'll keep this very brief, but I just wanted to kind of quickly start by saying I think what you've heard already this morning, and many of the people on the panel and joining us as well as attendees will know very intuitively, that understanding who ultimately benefits from a financial transaction is absolutely core to understanding so much about the way in which the world works around us. Rachel already outlined some of the ways in which understanding beneficial ownership can support with really, really fast procurement that's effective. It is at its foundation the most basic piece of due diligence that you can perform. And being able to do that quickly really does help you to be able to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to purchasing goods and services in an emergency situation. And Rachel's already outlined some of the many emerging stories we're hearing of how some of that procurement is going awry. I think also there's something really important to remember about how governments around the world are going to be able to take their populations with them as we move through this process of quarantine and relaxing of lockdown measures. Fundamentally, as many governments have already said to their citizens, we all have our role to play in this. We all have a very active need to be participating and performing our duty as citizens to make sure that we can reduce the risk. Doing that over a prolonged period of time until there is some kind of widely available vaccine, we could be looking at 18 to 24 months for that, and maintaining public trust and consent in a whole range of different contexts around the world is going to be a primary challenge for government, because without that, that public health intervention or public health interventions around quarantine or less strict forms of lockdown are going to be impossible to deliver. And maintaining that trust in government, in our policies and our response, being able to demonstrate to the public that support, money, financial assistance really is ending up in the hands of those that need it most is going to be essential to maintaining that trust and consent. And beneficial ownership disclosure and a good means of analysing your public procurement and spend and showing who really benefits is going to be crucial throughout all of that. I think also we need to think about this not just in terms of an emergency response, but also what the next 2 to 3 years of our lives looks like. We have an emergency response, and alongside that we have economic stabilization efforts, huge amounts of fiscal stimulus going into economies, as we've already mentioned. And as the IMF and Transparency International and others have argued for in the last couple of weeks, how we audit that in the future, how we keep the receipts is going to be really, really critical for that. But I do think it's incumbent upon us as a community, and we're working hard on this in open ownership, to really think through and provide really, really strong evidence-based advice about what keeping the receipts actually means. What are those key data points, those key pieces of analysis that people are going to want to see as they come into a phase of audit and inquiry into this? And as Sope has already mentioned, a public inquiry situation in which the behavior of officials and looking at sort of specific transactions back 4 or 5 months is going to place an additional strain on government. Making itself accountable and demonstrating that it's behaved in an efficient and sort of efficacious way isn't overhead free. So how we support government to come up with the very, very clear rules of the road for how COVID response should look for us is going to be really, really important. And I think finally, as John says, the systems, the administration, the challenges and the risks that governments around the world have taken into this crisis are, of course, and it's very obvious to say, the risks that we have today, and they are only exacerbated. For us as Open Ownership, we've been a very delivery-focused organisation, really thinking about how we can move from a country having no central register or a closed central register of beneficial ownership to really making that data open and effective, which means it's accurate and timely and verified. In a situation where governments are responding in an emergency fashion and resources draining away from some of these kind of long-term reform efforts, it really is incumbent upon us now to figure out what the practical next steps are. And I think for us, that kind of falls into a couple of spaces. I think one is around what are the sorts of conditions that should be placed on international financial assistance around beneficial ownership disclosure and effective procurement. We're beginning to see those emerge, and we need to get quite specific about those. But I think secondly, really making sure that across the world, civil society is able to step up and provide a really clear vision of what we believe good should look like when it comes to response and also counting the receipts, auditing the receipts in future, is going to be critical to help governments around the world sort of maintain trust and consent through all of this. We're really pleased today to be launching a new set of principles around beneficial ownership disclosure. There'll be 12 principles of effective beneficial ownership disclosure, which are all underpinned by some very kind of clear advice and guidance about how to implement them. And as we publish those, we really want to kind of get down to starting that conversation about what all governments can do, even in a resource-constrained and emergency environment, to make sure that their COVID response conforms to some of the most important principles that we're highlighting around beneficial ownership disclosure, and that we are gathering effective data that's going to help us understand and audit the response in the next few months and into the next 2 years. We're launching that today. It's a version 1 of that set of principles. We really want to bring together this community and many other actors in the space to kind of keep developing that, keep getting more practical, more straightforward about our advice and guidance to governments, such that we can be a really constructive partner in trying to tackle this crisis.
Thank you very much, Thom. We've got about half an hour left for a more general discussion and questions and answers. There've already been a couple of very interesting contributions have come in the chat function, which I hope we've all seen, which we could address. But and I personally had lots of questions for you all individually, quite specific ones. But could I just start by asking you all a general question, which is that to go back to Robert Choate's metaphor, aren't you spraying water again into the wind at the moment? I mean, against the fire. This is a bad time to be trying to seek the sorts of reforms you want, for precisely the reasons that you've all been explaining, that it's going to be extremely, at a time of such urgency, it's going to get very hard for people to focus on this. The emphasis is on getting things done, not on checking that they're being done right. And to go back to the much quoted IMF metaphor, by the time you're looking at the receipts, isn't it too late? So perhaps I could start with John if he's available. Could you take that on, and then maybe Thom and Rachel, Che and Sope, if you want to contribute, please just send me a message in chat.
I think you're absolutely right that must be the risk. That must be the danger, that people just say, don't trouble me with the accountancy. I just need to get on and get these masks from someone I've never heard of in a country far, far away at twice the normal price. I think that it's up to all of us, though, to say, actually, these aren't alternatives. This is an and, not an or conversation. One of the reasons why it isn't just a reckoning which may or may not be an exercise in dry accountancy after this is all over, is that we're talking about saving lives here. That's why you are trying to move so fast, public official. And if you really want to save lives, how come you are not worrying about wasting 10, 20, perhaps more % of the money you're spending? Just think of the number of lives that you could be saving or not saving by doing this wrong. And I think if we bring it back to that and say this isn't an alternative, this is something which should be an integral part of what you're trying to do, and actually you will be doing it really badly if you see it as a trade-off, then I think that we stand a chance of making it urgent and now and relevant today, rather than just a piece of dry accountancy, which may or may not happen at some point when the dust has all settled and the world's attention has perhaps moved on.
Thank you. Thom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about the interaction between the public health interventions you can make and the economic conditions you find yourself in. So much of the debate this side of getting a vaccine for COVID will be around the severity of quarantine. This is the only really highly effective public health intervention we currently have, which is to shut people in their homes or some version of distancing or restrictions on people's freedoms. So much of the choices around what severity of quarantine or lockdown you will make will depend upon how much capacity you have in your healthcare system to treat the people that need it. And you're seeing already in the UK, there's sort of one of the 5 tests that are being applied to relaxing quarantine in the UK. The 5th one is when we come to a second peak of this infection, and consensus suggests that we will, really our choice there is about how we avoid overwhelming our healthcare system. If you have seen major leakage through corruption, poor procurement, and so on and so forth in your healthcare system, your ability to cope with the volume of people becoming infected is diminished, which means you have to continue to restrict people's freedom to try and stop overwhelming your healthcare system. So avoiding loss, as John says, maximizing every dollar, pound, or whatever that you have to make sure that you have a functioning healthcare system is not a matter of nice to have. It is fundamentally the thing that is going to drive all of your other public policy choices. So we have to get that right. We have to get it right such that we can change our public health interventions and relax them. But we also have to get it right so we can demonstrate to the public and citizens around the world that government is responding effectively, and your participation in this, the choices you are making in your everyday life about whether to go to the shops right now or to go for something that's inessential, they are worth making because everybody is pulling in the same direction. If we can't show that, consent, support for the kind of public health interventions that we're making is going to drop over time. This really is a desperately important matter, and sort of overlooking it and sort of kicking it into the long grass of sort of, that sounds like dull accountancy that a Supreme Audit institution will do in a year's time, I think is fundamentally missing the point.
Thanks very much, Thom. I know Rachel has something to add on this point, and since she's coming on, and since you were talking about vaccines, I'd also like to her, if she doesn't mind, to pick up on something she talked about the risks in clinical trials that there are. Because I was up late last night editing a story on our website about this Indian firm, Serum International, which is just taking an enormous punt on the Oxford vaccine. It's going to start producing, I think it's between 20 and 40 million doses of this stuff before it's even been through human clinical trials, before it's been approved. So you can see that's an extreme example of the way pressure would build up for getting these things approved. But I, in my naivety, had thought that those sorts of global regulatory bodies that would approve vaccines like that must be relatively impermeable. So that's what you were originally going to say, and my question, Rachel.
I was just going to say, in terms of the first question, that Thom is absolutely right, but there are, it's the short-term implication, but there are also much, much longer-term implications for the levels of trust that citizens and public have in their health systems. The whole basis of universal health coverage anywhere is the trust that people have about the service they are going to receive, the value for money they're going to receive, whether the treatment that they get when they go to those health facilities actually delivers health outcomes. So they need to see that this stuff works in order to buy in much longer term to the social contract of universal health coverage. That was my kind of point on the first question. On the second question about clinical trials, yes, you're absolutely right. But I think that, and I think again we've referred to the extent that we all have a part to play here. But this is particularly academics, scientists, publishers, medical publishers, universities, and funders in the clinical trials regime and kind of regulatory ecosystem. but also the media. We are all putting so much pressure and expectation on the scientists to deliver. And, you know, you simply cannot cut the corners on clinical trial system design to the extent that, you know, we can expect that the vaccines and the diagnostics and the treatments that we get out are going to be of the same level, quality, totally assured as if they were going on for years. You know, we are asking them to make such shortcuts. And, you know, there are lots of reports at the moment about the extent to which clinical trials on particular drugs are being conducted without control groups, questioning the size of those groups. And yes, some of that can be done, you know, within the existing system. But actually what we're talking about is registration of clinical trials and registration of results, and the degree of detail that happens about both of those contexts. It's what you are saying you are trialing, how you are doing it, how the design is formulated, how your trial is designed, and then reporting promptly to ensure that there is open access to that science.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Che, you also wanted to chip in.
Thanks, Simon. Actually, Rachel did such a good job in covering the points that I was going to, so I'll be extremely brief, but only two very quick points here. The first, I think that we tend to fall into a bit of a false choice between, or a binary choice, but it is a one or the other. Yes, there is a trade-off, but there's also a vast amounts of capability, both in the private sector and the public sector, and it's really about how we can use each other's capability. And a very simple example, so we recently wanted to do more to play a role to support the healthcare sector. So we offered, and we went out to healthcare groups and public agencies that, look, if you need to do some minimum screening, you know, please use our data for free. You know, if there's some high risk areas that, or high risk counterparties that you're potentially considering doing businesses or getting supplies, then you know, please use us. So I think there's a lot of goodwill out there, both in the private sector to help the public sector. The second piece is, there is a, you know, when we talk about taxpayer funds of fiscal stimulus, there's a bit of a fiduciary responsibility as well, because the public will, you know, there'll be incredibly amount of scrutiny, not only after COVID, or I think, you know, there will always be a COVID with us. And then the third is, when you look at the bottleneck, you know, I have incredible sympathy and empathy for the public sector, who are being, and we know many of them in terms of the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and many of the fiscal mechanisms, and then the distribution mechanisms of what's being asked of them. And many times they're under-resourced as well. So you know, I think that if there's another way that we can, you know, sort of use each other's strengths and capability, then I think we can achieve both. You know, efficiency and some kind of accountability framework as well.
Since you're there and talking, Che, could I just ask you, thinking back to your experience in New York during the financial crash, did you see lessons there in the way that huge fiscal stimulus was used and abused for the way the world is reacting now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I know a few months right at the outbreak, sometime in February, I think I wrote a very quick post on LinkedIn that there, you know, I was there for September 11th. I was there for, you know, the financial crisis. You know, every so, and there's definitely a narrative in terms of what I brought with me. The first is absolutely, you know, think in different ways. Everything that we did from the financial crisis in terms of all the liquidity provisions, maiden lane facility for AIG, etc., had never been done before. In fact, it was a question of what legal authority we have, but there's a very nice phrase within the Federal Reserve Act that basically says, you know, under unusual exigent circumstances, and so we took a role and certainly a lot of things that I hadn't never been done before. But the other aspect was trying to, and not being bogged down by lawyers. Just because it hadn't been done before doesn't mean that you can't find new ways of working and trying to and build confidence in the system. Social psychology is a very interesting thing when it comes to the financial markets. It's not that you are in control of the crisis; it's the appearance that you're in control of the crisis. And appearance is all about being quite open in terms of what you're doing and building confidence among the players. That at least you're trying to think differently and trying to do something at the end of it. I think the mistake, my personal view at the end of it, that we didn't put enough onus on where all that capital went and where all that liquidity went. And I think that we should have done more to hold banks account to how they actually dispensed with the liquidity that was then being issued. But those are debates that many can have. But absolutely, I think speed and collaboration. And don't be afraid of making mistakes. I think it's are the key lessons for me.
Thanks very much. I draw your attention to two very interesting contributions in chat from Gavin Heyman and Heather Marquette. Heather's also asked a question, which I'll come to in a minute, but first there's a direct question from Sheila Masinde of Transparency International Kenya, which is, how can countries that are yet to enact legislation or adopt policies or regulations to enhance transparency and beneficial ownership, open contracting or access to information, how can they ensure clean procurement in response efforts? Professor Sope, I think that question has your name on it. It doesn't, but I think it should have.
So I think it's a great question. Thank you, Sheila. I think even if a country doesn't have specific legislation that addresses beneficial ownership, every country has rules around public financial management. Every country has rules around ethics in management, in governance, basically, whether it's public procurement. So even if you don't have specific laws saying, on beneficial ownership or on access to procurement information, there's other things that would allow a government to act openly. And I think governments acting openly, even if they don't have legislation, is still the right thing to do. And there will be other pieces of legislation that would support them actually doing the right thing. So it's good that you have that legislation, but it's better, whether the legislation is there or not, that you actually do the right thing and deal in an open and transparent and an honest way, even if the legislation is not there. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much. So on to the question from Heather Marquette. Well, I beg your pardon. I should have said, did anybody else want to want to put up an answer to that question as well?
Yeah, I thought Sope's answer was absolutely bang on. I just wanted to add one more comment to it, which was simply that there are network effects here. So the more countries we can get to set up readily accessible open ownership, beneficial ownership registers, the easier it becomes to both shame those who aren't part of that network, but also to fill in gaps anyway. So if you have a country that isn't part of that network, but is contracting with companies or providers which are, it still means that civil society in those countries can do quite a good job. It isn't perfect, but the network effects really start to accelerate the more countries we get to join this. That's why I've been pushing this idea of a sort of establishing a global norm. Why Sidanius' point about getting companies to try and push the G20, I'm really pleased to hear that they're doing that. That's absolutely essential. And why these new standards, which I haven't even had a chance to look at in detail, just published today by Open Ownership, all these are moving in the right direction. So even if some countries are still not doing it, network effect should be increasingly powerful as we start to pick up scope and volume here amongst different countries.
Thank you very much. Does there anybody else want to chip in on what can countries without the relevant laws do?
I had a quick thought, and I know Che wanted to come in as well. I mean, what I'd say is, and this picks up very much on Sope's point, you have a lot of existing powers in procurement legislation or the kind of ethics of public financial management. There are some very simple interventions you can do simply with new suppliers that are potentially coming into the space to win work. You can ask them to disclose the very basic elements of their beneficial ownership structures, and if they're unable to do that, then I think you can sort of feed that into your due diligence thinking about who you're about to start working with and why their corporate ownership structure is so complex they can't quite quickly give you some information about it. So whilst we at OpenOwnership have been working really hard on what the kind of gold standard of disclosure looks like for a whole of economy verified set of data about all of the businesses that operate within your jurisdiction, this can be done in a risk-based way. As you're procuring new things within the healthcare sector, you can ask for simple pieces of information. You will probably have the legal basis to do that already. So I think there are a lot of options out there for governments who are taking in relatively weak beneficial ownership systems into this crisis. There's clearly not the headspace to do everything right now, but there are some sort of minimum standards that I think we can as a community request. And I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to be extraordinarily clear about what we think those minimum standards need to be and help governments produce the kind of policy and guidance that will allow them to do that. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand over to Che if he still has a comment.
Very quickly, so I just wanted to pick on John and your, Thom's incredible important point about, you call it the network effect. I almost tend to think of kind of the force multiplier effect, when you just need to get a few key nodes and push those key nodes. And I think, and this is in fact how me and Thom were introduced to each other through an initiative organized by the World Economic Forum and others, in terms of providing some real practical guidance through a pilot program to kind of look at, how different countries are using and verifying the information. And on top of that initiative, there's the B20 that I referenced to, and there's also an EU, as you all probably know, are going through an AML action plan to prepare themselves for really digging up the road on AML, right? So there will be a 6th anti-money laundering directive. The 5th isn't even dry yet, in which public registries will be is in front and center, given all the issues in Europe in the last few years. So those are examples, and I think this group is a perfect example. There are a few examples of very active participation and making practical recommendations, and that's why I'm very much looking forward to working with this group and OpenOwnership and many others who have been doing this for quite a while. But we already have quite a powerful network that we're going to be very active and working and collaborating together and sharing each other's expertise.
So let's move on to Heather's very interesting question. This is Heather Marquette from the University of Birmingham, who's now a senior research fellow at DFID on secondment there. And she asked, the move by the governments of Denmark, Poland, and now France to block firms registered in tax havens from receiving state bailouts could have an anti-corruption effect as well, particularly if they and other countries were also to block the same firms from public procurement opportunities too, or at least move them to the back of the queue. Do you think that this could be a feasible way to reward companies that behaved responsibly before COVID-19 and send signals to other companies post-COVID? With Che's important point about unintended consequences in mind, are there any downsides to this approach? Adding, of course, that not all companies in tax havens are bad and not all outside tax havens are good, of course. That was addressed to anybody who's willing to put their hand up or signal attention. Is there anyone willing to take that on?
I think she's touching on a really important point here. But I would hesitate to. It's not quite a sort of perfect match, because the thing which we are all fighting against here, and what we're all speaking about here, is about secrecy jurisdictions, and whether or not something is a tax haven or not may mean that there also are secrecy jurisdictions. Many are, but there are also many which are secrecy jurisdictions which aren't terribly good tax havens either. So you just got to be careful that we're aiming at the same thing all the time. And while there may be heavy overlap in many places, she's also right to point out that there are plenty of examples where both there are companies that are registered in different countries for very good reasons, and we shouldn't just automatically assume that it's all bad. And there are also legal entities that aren't companies. And we've been mainly talking about companies here, but there are plenty of other legal entities which can equally well be used for the kinds of dodgy purposes that we're talking about here. You could use trusts for this, you could use some kinds of partnerships for it. You can even, in some jurisdictions, I'm told, I'm no lawyer, use foundations and so on. And so we need to be really clear that while it may be a convenient shorthand, yes, he's absolutely right. What we're really talking about here is secrecy jurisdictions, whatever their tax haven status may be. Often that's the same thing, but not always.
Sure, understood. Thom, did you want to add anything on this?
Very briefly, it's agree with everything that John has said, and I think actually the actions by Denmark, Poland, France, Argentina, I think has made a kind of similar pledge. I think it has a great signalling effect, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And I think it's raising up the sort of public priority list and the level of awareness around some of these regimes in ways that hitherto we probably would have thought unimaginable. This is gaining a lot of kind of public attention now, which I think is really positive and prompts a really useful debate. What we don't have time for today, but something I think we are going to have to quite quickly address, is how our global taxation system is going to respond to this crisis as well. How will transfer pricing work in an environment of huge losses for many companies around the world? How will they be managing their tax base to reduce their exposure? Where will they book their losses? How will this impact trade pricing? Tax Justice Network, I think, are doing phenomenal work in beginning to flesh out what some of those issues are and where the kind of key bits of policy reform are required around country by country reporting, greater tax transparency more generally. I think this is as we go into that sort of really long-term period of economic stabilization, before we can even think about what meaningful recovery looks like, without a vaccine. Those are going to be key questions. And again, beneficial ownership transparency sits at the heart of kind of effective tax regimes as much as it does as effective procurement. So I think collectively we need to be spending a lot more time thinking and focusing on some of those challenges that are perhaps 2 or 3 months down the road for us.
Could I also ask you to pick up on something you said in your original remarks, where you were talking about the attachment of conditions to foreign aid around the transparency of beneficial ownership regulations. And I just wonder whether there isn't a risk, as so often in conditionality with foreign aid, of attracting accusations of hypocrisy, that we are asking the developing world to do more than we're doing ourselves in some cases.
Yes, absolutely, and without kind of picking on specific countries, there are some major economies around the world that remain, really behind the curve when it comes to, effective company ownership disclosure, and a number of those large multilateral institutions are based in some of those countries. So yes, I think that charge exists, but I think we have to sort of unpick the policy problem a little bit and say, where is the financial aid coming from, and what do we need that to look like, both to support our kind of global awareness and understanding of where the money's going and if it's being used effectively, but also really give as much support to those recipient governments as possible to help them deliver those conditions. Because I think we're talking about them not because they are those conditions are in themselves sort of nice to haves. We're talking about them because they aid effective public service delivery. And I think what we keep coming back to in this conversation is exactly that point. It is all of our task to make sure that we have effective public administrations around the world that are going to support people in their hour of need, and we all have a part to play in that. So I think I would just approach that conditionality debate from a slightly different perspective, not one of punitive measure, but one of saying, here's what we think is going to help all of us get through this, because we are all affected by this. There is no country on earth that is untouched by it. Therefore, we all have an obligation to one another to lift us all up.
Thanks very much, Thom. I don't see any more actual questions in chat. So could I ask another general one too, which is actually one suggested by Open Ownership themselves, rather to my surprise, because I'm assuming the answer is no. But the question was, is it possible to put a figure or guess on just how much money is being lost to corruption at the moment in public responses to COVID? A percentage, I guess, rather than a number.
I can say that if we look at what happened with the Ebola pandemic in Syria alone, 30% of the funds that were allocated to addressing the Ebola issue were lost. So 30% in the audit that was done afterwards couldn't be accounted for. And those figures are also consistent with what we lose from public procurement systems in countries that don't have strong systems. So I'll be guessing that it would be around that 20 to 30% at the end of the day. But it's too
in countries with poor legal systems.
In countries with less than robust procurement and auditing systems and accountability systems.
Hi, Rachel.
Just, I mean, we don't have accurate figures for now, but we do know that WHO estimates are that kind of 6 to 8% of global health spend annually is lost to corruption. Now, I don't think any of us are in any doubt that that is being massively magnified at the moment, and that with the immense sums that we've been talking about that are additionally going into those health systems, the figures are bound to be bigger.
Yeah, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the health sector was particularly prone to corruption, which I found in a way surprising. But why do you think that is?
It's because of the asymmetries of power, the complexity, and just the sheer volume. So the asymmetries of power, where you've got governments, you've got immensely powerful industry, private sector, pharma companies. You've got ultimately us as a public who are in our time of need actually quite vulnerable. And then you've got governments, you've got many different manifestations of health system, how they're structured, how they're funded. And you've got as I said at the beginning, a very long, complex value chain, all the way from, R&D to, the delivery of your medicine in a health facility in rural Africa. So there are many reasons, but it's a very, very big problem in the sector. Thank you very much.
I think we're very nearly out of time, but what I'd like to do, if it's all right with everybody, is just to give you all a chance to have a final say. If you'd like to sum up just for 30 seconds or so, your main takeaways from this discussion and the points you'd really like people to go away remembering. And perhaps we could do that in the order of the supposed order of speakers, starting with you, John.
I just want to add 2 points, if I could, to two of the most recent comments. One is this point which Thom was finishing on about aid conditionality. I think that one of the much bigger opportunities, which all countries, but I think particularly the UK at the moment, given Brexit, is facing, is trade conditionality. So international trade agreements and having really strong, effective anti-corruption chapters in those could be an enormous step in the right direction. And it's one of those things that, because it's public and international, it's the kind of thing which is therefore already established, you hope, when the next global emergency comes along, and therefore creates a higher bar from which people can then begin to try and take shortcuts, and it just establishes a higher norm. So I think that is the big opportunity, which we didn't really have a chance to touch on here, but I think is a big possibility. And the other point which I'd add to Rachel's final comment is, I'm sure there's a huge opportunity, she's right, about the risks of misspending their health money. But the other facet, which again we've all mentioned in passing here, is the enormous amount of money that is being spent on economic either bounce back or prop up, or trying to stop firms from going bust over the course of the pandemic, and that creates a whole parallel set of opportunities for organised criminals, which we shouldn't forget either. And some of the money being spent there, certainly in this country, but I'm sure elsewhere, is equally as big as the money that's being spent on health, and that creates a huge additional set of opportunities as well. And that's a really nice cat.
She's very nice, but she wasn't supposed to be here. But clearly she found you too fascinating, John. Rachel, do you have anything further to add?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Just a couple of final things. The first is we haven't mentioned the role of watchdogs and whistleblowers in this, and they both actually have a current, so in the kind of immediate short-term element. Don't shut those functions down. Remember remember them, and ensure that the protection mechanisms are in there to mobilise them. And just finally, on the kind of the final comments, I suppose we need to look ahead to the opportunities that this provides us, and in terms of restructuring, reframing the understanding and the dialogue about public financial management, expenditure allocation, procurement transparency, and that element of social accountability, and how all of that can be brought together to build back better, I suppose, for even the weakest health systems.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Sope.
Okay, thanks everyone for having me again. There are 2 points that I want to underline that we haven't given much attention. So the first one is about the anti-competitive practices of the private sector. I mean, we've mentioned price gouging and what's happening with that. And also, maybe just to sound a warning, that procurement systems will remember those companies, I think, further down the line. There will be a reckoning for them as well. And the other thing, which I think has been giving me a lot of concern, is the fact, or is the way organized criminals are taking advantage of this pandemic. So we've seen in Italy and in Cape Town as well, where gangs in Cape Town and the mafia in Italy are providing palliatives to vulnerable groups and buying their loyalty. They're buying businesses that are going bust, and they're positioning themselves to be the benefactors of these people, and when this is all over. So I think in Italy, the government is aware and they're trying to do something about it. But in South Africa, we don't understand the effect that they're having. So the gangs apparently had a truce, but they're using that truce. They're distributing food parcels, but within those food parcels are their drugs, are their guns. And so, yeah, there's going to be a shitstorm coming, and I think we need to be aware of the implications of that.
Yeah, there have been similar stories from Brazil, I think, too. Che.
So first of all, thank you, Simon, for moderating this. And we're all getting used to a new era of understanding all the functionalities of different webinar platforms. So
you're getting used to my cat.
And also, of course, thanks to OpenOwnership for bringing this together, and personally, thanks for the invitation. So just a few remarks. One is related to John's piece around network. There is a momentum, as I mentioned, at the political level and also in the industry, to tackle the UBO piece in particular. And to offer very concrete steps and not just sort of political communiques on the issue, which has been done at the G20 for the last few years. But the recognition that this is not just about an issue of transparency for transparency's sake, but this is actually business enabling, because it increases the effectiveness, it reduces risks for many of in the industry. And it also makes it easier for us to understand who we're doing business with at the end of the day. So I think there is, and I don't think COVID-19 is going to sort of stop that momentum. The second is, I think the issues around fraud and corruption is not going to go away. I think there's going to be quite a bit of continued media attention on this. There already has been by BBC and many others. And of course, that's been helped in the last few years by money laundering and corruption being very popular topics in as films and TV series. Certainly helped by McMafia and all the rest of it. So this consciousness and awareness of these issues, I think, has never been greater. And then I would share with you again the vulnerabilities here, and I share these as a function of our relationship and advice from law enforcement. So there's three things that they're seeing. One is that the healthcare sector, as we talked about, is being targeted. And this again comes from Interpol. There are vulnerable sectors that are going to be targeted, like NGOs and other organizations who are going to lose funding. We're going to really be cash strapped, and organized criminals will take advantage of that in terms of some of their money laundering activities. And as I mentioned previously, that the most vulnerable are also going to be targeted. So those who are unemployed are going to be approached to be money mules. and there's different patterns of human trafficking emerging according to Europol. So again, I share this with you from the insights from law enforcement. But I think that the regulatory pressure is going to continue as far as AML legislation all around the world. We've seen instances by the US Treasury and the European Commission that yes, you may have to make some choices in terms of, in the private sector where you focus your efforts, but that does not mean that you can do business with someone who's on a sanctions list, or that you shouldn't do your due diligence as part of your BAU. So I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Che. And now the final last word goes to Thom.
I'll keep this really, really brief. What I'm going to say is this. We are at the very start of a very changed world in which we're all living in. The political context we're working in, the political economy we're working in is different from how it was 3 months ago. And this crisis, this change is going to last for a very, very long time. But I think there are reasons, if we can maintain our kind of energy and focus, there are reasons to feel incredibly possible. The political window of what's possible is changing. It will continue to change. There is an opportunity for us to make the case that the kind of reform that we have been talking about for so long now can facilitate the kind of services, the kind of healthcare delivery, the kind of lives that we've always claimed that it could. So I actually think we have a profound opportunity over the next couple of years as those political sands shift and the window on what is possible moves, to do something really amazing that will set us up to respond to this crisis, the stabilization of our economies and the recovery in a really effective way.
Thank you very much, Thom. Well, I think it only remains to me to thank OpenOwnership for organising this, for inviting me to moderate it. I found it very instructive, very helpful. Thank you very much. To our panellists, who all made brilliant contributions, I thought, and to those of you who have contributed to the very interesting debate in chat, and of course to the cat. So thank you all very much.